Rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the cobblestones of a quiet street in London's upscale West End. The evening fog clung to every building, thick enough to obscure the street lamp's yellow glow. Inside a grand ballroom, the last remnants of a lavish party lingered like a distant echo. Guests had departed hours ago, leaving only a handful of staff to clean up. Yet something in the air was not right. A disquiet, almost imperceptible, that carried a strange heaviness. Hercule Poirot stood just inside the ballroom's entry, his polished shoes making little sound against the marble floor. His sharp eyes scanned the scene with the careful precision of a jeweler inspecting a rare stone. The party, held in honor of an illustrious aristocrat's 70th birthday, had been a memorable affair, but it had all come to an abrupt halt when the body was found. Inspector Japp, his ever-faithful companion, waited in a corner of the tea room. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, his expression one of confusion and frustration. He had dealt with countless murders in his time, but nothing quite like this. "We have a dead man, Poirot, but no answers," Japp muttered clearly. Troubled, Poirot nodded, his gaze flickering over the room. The deceased, Lord Montague Grayson, lay lifeless on the polished oak floor, his hands splayed out to either side of him, fingers curled as though in mid-motion. His lips were parted, frozen in an expression of shock. It seemed almost as though he had been in the middle of something important, before it all came to an end. "What is it that is so unusual about the crime, mon ami?" Poirot asked softly, his voice measured. "Everything," Japp replied, his frustration evident. "At first it looked like a natural death. He was found here, in the ballroom, alone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. But then there's the clue." Poirot's gaze shifted to the center of the room, where a single object caught his attention, a broken champagne flute lying beside the body. Its delicate crystal shards glittered against the deep red carpet, as if mocking the severity of the situation. Yet there was something more, something else that did not quite add up. The glass had been positioned carefully, placed just so as though it were a deliberate act, not the result of a careless stumble or mishap. Poirot's sharp mind began to weave the pieces together, though they made no immediate sense. Lord Montague had been a man of considerable wealth, surrounded by a bevy of acquaintances. There had been no apparent motive, no love triangle, no financial ruin. He had been respected, admired even in high society. So, what had happened here? Japp broke the silence. "We did a full sweep of the ballroom. No sign of anyone leaving or entering. The staff all have alibis. No forced entry. No fingerprints. Nothing." "And the clue?" Poirot inquired. "A single music sheet," Japp said, his voice lowered. "Found beside the glass, not just any music sheet, a waltz. The last waltz, to be precise." Poirot moved slowly to the piano near the back of the room, where a partially open sheet of music rested. He took it in his hands and carefully read the title. The Last Waltz, but the composition was unfamiliar to him, and no one seemed to know who the composer was. He examined the notes on the page. It was a haunting piece filled with melancholy undertones. But what was its purpose here, in this place? "A strange thing, is it not, mon ami?" Poirot murmured. "A waltz, why this one in particular? A gesture of nostalgia, or perhaps a reminder?" Japp scratched his head. "Could be. But why leave it like this, Poirot? Who would go to such lengths to give a clue, and then just leave it?" Poirot's mind clicked into place. His gaze shifted from the piano to the door leading out of the ballroom, and then to the walls, lined with portraits of the Grayson family, each meticulously painted. They were beautiful works of art, but now they seemed to hold a dark, unsettling quality. "There is something more to this than a simple death," Poirot said. "This is not an ordinary murder. No, no. This is a riddle, one that we must solve before it slips through our fingers." As he spoke, a sudden realization crossed his mind. The waltz, the broken glass, the ballroom, the sense of melancholy that hung in the air. It all pointed to something far greater than mere chance. Whoever had committed this crime had not done so on impulse. No, this was a carefully orchestrated act, a grand gesture that only someone with a deep understanding of the human mind could have carried out. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he took a step toward the body. There was something in the way Lord Montague's body was positioned, the way his hand rested near the broken glass, as if he had been trying to grasp something in his final moments. And then there was the expression on his face, frozen in terror. "My body," Poirot murmured to himself, bending slightly over it, his eyes flicking from the expression to the placement of the hand. "The clue is in the positioning." Japp watched as Poirot began to piece things together, his mind working at a speed that Japp could barely keep up with. The detective's sharp eye had already caught things the inspector had missed. There was a story here, hidden in the folds of the crime, and Poirot was intent on uncovering it. The music, the glass, the body. Poirot's voice trailed off as he paced the room, connecting the dots with the precision of a master. Each detail added up to something deeper, something darker. But still, the question remained. Who had done this, and why? As Poirot's mind raced, he knew one thing for certain. This case was far from over. The last waltz had only just begun. Poirot took a deep breath, the damp air thick with tension, before turning his gaze toward the figure standing in the doorway. A man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his posture straight and proud. He had entered quietly, unnoticed by the others. Yet the moment he stepped into the room, something about him seemed to command attention. The newcomer was tall, his dark hair neatly combed back, his face sharp and well-defined, with a gaze that carried the weight of experience. He looked like a man who had seen much and understood even more. As he scanned the room, his eyes briefly met Poirot's, and for a fleeting moment the two men locked eyes, as if acknowledging each other's presence in a quiet, mutual recognition. "Poirot," said the man, his voice low but firm, "I trust. I'm not intruding." "Not at all, mon ami," Poirot replied, his voice smooth and deliberate. "The situation is most intriguing, as you will soon see." The man stepped closer, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with the precision of a surgeon. He glanced briefly at Lord Montague's body, his lips tightening but did not linger. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the strange object, the broken champagne flute. The new arrival, an inspector from Scotland Yard named Alistair Reed, had a reputation for being thorough, though his methods were sometimes a bit too by the book, for Poirot's liking. He was, however, no fool, and the detective had learned long ago not to underestimate him. Reed had a habit of noticing things that others overlooked, a trait that had earned him respect in his own right. "I assume you've taken all the standard measures?" Reed asked, stepping around the room with a practiced eye. "We have," Japp replied, his voice a bit defensive. "The room's been locked since the body was found. No signs of forced entry. Everything points to an accident or natural causes, but there's this. He gestured toward the waltz, sheet music, which Poirot had left carefully folded on the piano. Reed took the sheet in his hands, flipping through it with quiet concentration before nodding slowly. Unusual, he muttered, but not without meaning, I would wager. Poirot watched him with a mixture of amusement and approval. Reed had caught the significance of the music immediately, though perhaps not in the same way the detective had. It was more than a mere clue. It was a message, though from whom and for what purpose remained a mystery. What do you make of it, Reed? Poirot asked. Reed paused, turning the sheet over, as if expecting to find more than what was plainly visible. Hard to say, he replied, his brow furrowing. But I'll tell you this. The Grayson family is well connected. Lord Montague was no fool, and neither was his late wife. If this was a sign or a clue, it wasn't a random one. Poirot nodded, pleased with the insight. Reed's words had confirmed what the detective had already suspected. The Graysons had always been a fixture in high society, their connections spanning both politics and the arts. For such an elite family, a random act of violence seemed out of place, almost too trivial. The inspector's focus then shifted to the staff members still present in the room. A butler, a maid, and a younger woman, possibly a relative, stood, huddled near the far corner, exchanging uneasy glances. Each of them had been questioned already, but their stories, though consistent, seemed rehearsed. Too rehearsed. Poirot approached the maid first. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with wide eyes and a nervous twitch in her fingers. She held a damp cloth in her hand, and though she was not involved in the immediate investigation, her presence here was peculiar, especially since the staff had been ordered to stay in the background. "And you, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his tone gentle but direct. "What is it that you have seen? That you know?" The maid's eyes flickered, her breath catching slightly, as if she had not expected to be singled out. She quickly lowered her gaze, biting her lip as though weighing whether to speak the truth or conceal something. I don't know much, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just cleaning when they found him." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind working like clockwork. Something about the maid's reaction felt off. Her unease wasn't born from fear of the crime itself, but something more personal. She hadn't been in the room when Lord Montague collapsed, but she might have been too close to the truth to let her guard down so easily. Japp caught the subtle exchange, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Poirot's growing suspicion. "You think she knows something more?" he asked quietly. "I do," Poirot replied, his eyes never leaving the maid's trembling form. "But what?" As Poirot continued to observe the young woman, Reed had moved to a different part of the room, his gaze narrowing at a small, seemingly insignificant object resting on the side table. It was a delicate handkerchief, embroidered with a family crest, the Grayson family crest no less. Reed picked it up carefully, inspecting it before holding it out for Japp to see. "A personal item," he remarked. "Odd to find it lying here, don't you think? If the staff had nothing to do with it, why leave this behind?" Japp's brow furrowed. Could be a clue. Or a distraction, Poirot mused aloud, his eyes still focused on the maid. "It's a deliberate act of misdirection, a token, meant to divert attention." Reed's eyes widened as he seemed to realize what Poirot was suggesting. "You think someone planted this to point to the staff?" I believe so, Poirot said, his voice soft but firm. But not without purpose. The question is, who is behind it? As they spoke, the maid seemed to shrink further into herself, her eyes darting nervously between Poirot and Reed. There was no doubt in Poirot's mind. Now, the young woman knew more than she was letting on. Before he could approach her again, however, the door opened once more, and an unexpected guest stepped into the room, a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a dark overcoat and wearing a solemn expression. His features were drawn tight with grief, but there was something else in his eyes, something more calculating. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice dripping with frustration. "What is the meaning of all this? My cousin is dead, and you've done nothing but stand around, playing." "At detectives." Reed stepped forward to calm the man, but Poirot's gaze remained fixed on him. The newcomer was a cousin to Lord Montague, and though he appeared distraught, there was an air about him, something in his demeanour, that hinted at a far deeper involvement in the matter than mere family grief. Poirot smiled to himself, already sensing that the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The last waltz, it seemed, was not yet over. It was merely waiting for the right dancer to reveal the next step. The cousin, a tall man with sharp features, stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the gathering with an air of restrained indignation. He looked as though he had been summoned from some private sanctuary of grief, his face pale, but his voice betraying something else entirely, something far less genuine. "Who are you to question me like this?" he demanded, though his tone carried a touch of anger, as if he were accustomed to receiving deference. His gaze darted toward Poirot, narrowing. "I am Edmund Grayson, and I will not stand by while you waste time with these ridiculous games." Poirot remained calm, offering the man a slight nod. "I understand, Monsieur Grayson. The grief you must feel is great, but you see, the matter at hand requires careful examination. Every detail, no matter how trivial, could be of great significance." Grayson's face stiffened, but he said nothing more as he stepped aside, allowing Poirot to approach the others. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked from one suspect to the next, noting every movement, every twitch, every hesitant glance exchanged between the maid, the butler, and the young woman. Each of them had already provided their accounts, but they seemed to weigh their words too carefully, as though hiding something just out of reach. The maid, still clutching her damp cloth, was first to be called again. Her hands, now shaking slightly, fumbled with the edges of the cloth, as if it were the only thing holding her together. I don't know what you want me to say," she said, her voice faltering under the weight of Poirot's gaze. "I was cleaning when it happened, and I saw nothing at all." "Ah, but mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice gentle but piercing, "you were in the very room when Lord Montague collapsed, were you not? Surely you must have seen something, perhaps an odd noise or some movement, perhaps even a face." Her eyes flickered nervously to the side before she spoke again, almost too quickly. "I told you there was nothing. Her words caught in her throat, and she hastily added, I thought I heard a noise outside, but I didn't see anything. Nothing that would have helped." Poirot studied her intently, noticing the way her gaze darted to the window as she spoke. A noise outside. He had seen no evidence of anything amiss in the garden, yet her statement did not sit right with him. The way she avoided his eyes now confirmed his suspicion. She was hiding something, whether intentionally or not. Before he could probe further, Japp approached the butler, who stood rigidly near the door, observing the scene with a stoic expression. He had yet to say much, and that in itself was telling. Japp's voice was firm. "And you, Carter? What can you tell us?" The butler's lips pressed into a thin line, his face an impassive mask. "I've told you everything I know, sir. I did not hear anything. I was not near Lord Montague at the time. I only came in after the others." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. The butler's tone was too controlled, too practiced. "Ah, Monsieur Carter," he began, his voice soft but insistent. "You seem certain of what you did not hear. You see, there is a certain rhythm to silence, n'est-ce pas? And yet, there is something in your words that suggests a different kind of silence, one that comes from knowing something and choosing not to reveal it." Carter's eyes flicked nervously to the side, his expression momentarily faltering, but only for an instant. The butler recovered quickly, his voice tightening with resolve. "I am a servant in this house, Monsieur Poirot. It is not my place to speculate." Poirot gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Of course, Monsieur Carter. It is never the place of a servant to speculate, but it is our place to observe, n'est-ce pas? To see and hear what others may not." The tension between them was palpable, but Poirot's attention was already shifting. The young woman, still standing off to the side, was the next to be approached. She was the cousin of Lord Montague's late wife, a fact that Poirot had learned earlier, though it seemed to weigh less on her than her family connections. She stood with an air of quiet dignity, but there was something else in her posture, a slight shift, a subtle tightness to her jaw, that suggested she, too, was hiding something, mademoiselle. Poirot's voice was smooth, his eyes never leaving hers. "You seem rather composed. Under the circumstances, of course. I would imagine such a sudden loss might unnerve someone." She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile curving her lips, but it was the sort of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Monsieur Poirot, but I assure you I'm quite all right. Grief is a personal matter. We all cope in our own ways." Poirot observed her closely, the way her hands were clasped tightly in front of her as though she were physically restraining herself. "Indeed," he replied, his tone laced with an understanding that seemed to unnervingly pierce through the surface of her composure. "But, mademoiselle, if I may ask, what is it that you were doing just before Lord Montague collapsed?" Her smile faltered for just a moment. I was in the garden," she said quickly, her voice gaining strength. "I went outside to get some air. It was very hot in the room." Poirot took a step closer, his eyes locking onto her with an almost predatory intensity. "And when you returned, mademoiselle, you found him already on the floor." She hesitated. The faintest quiver ran through her lips, and for a brief moment Poirot could see the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. "Yes," she said. Finally, but the lack of conviction in her voice told Poirot that the answer was a fabrication. A very well-crafted one, but a lie nonetheless. Before Poirot could press her further, the distant sound of footsteps interrupted. A new figure appeared, one that Poirot had been expecting, though he could not have predicted the timing. Edmund Grayson had been observing the proceedings from the corner of the room, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. But now, he made his way over, stepping forward with a quiet resolve. "Forgive my interruption, but I have a suggestion," he said, his voice cold and calculating. If we are to be thorough, perhaps we should examine Lord Montague's correspondence. There may be hints there, things that might help explain this tragedy. Poirot's sharp gaze shifted toward Grayson, watching him closely as the man continued. After all, my cousin's business dealings have been complicated, and his enemies numerous. There's no telling who might have wished him harm. The detective's lips twitched in the barest of smiles. Edmund Grayson was presenting himself as helpful, but Poirot had long since learned that the most helpful individuals often had the most to hide. An excellent idea, Monsieur Grayson, Poirot said smoothly, and yet perhaps it is the hidden motives, those little details that are missed by the eyes of the innocent, that will lead us to the truth, no? Grayson stiffened slightly, and Poirot could see the tension tightening in his posture. He was not accustomed to being questioned in such a manner, not by someone like Poirot, whose unrelenting gaze seemed to see straight through to his very soul. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and though Poirot was far from uncovering the entire truth, one thing was becoming glaringly clear. Someone in this room was hiding more than just grief. The following days were filled with a palpable sense of tension, the house heavy with the silence of secrets. Poirot's every move seemed to be met with guarded glances and strained smiles, each suspect playing their role with a calculated precision. Yet, beneath the veneer of politeness, Poirot knew that each of them had a story to tell, a story that they were unwilling to share in full. The detective's mind had been busy, working through the maze of motives and contradictions that had surfaced during his interviews. Greed, revenge, jealousy and fear, each one seemed to provide a possible explanation, yet none could account for everything. The more he investigated, the more tangled the web became. His sense of logic told him there was a piece missing, a detail that connected it all. He began with Edmund Grayson. Grayson's suggestion of investigating Lord Montague's business dealings had been delivered with the sort of opportunistic flair that suggested a man more interested in his own gain than the truth. Poirot had already uncovered that Grayson had been in considerable debt that Lord Montague had repeatedly bailed him out of. But there was something more. The younger Grayson, having been informed of the possibility of inheritance upon his cousin's death, had been one of the few to express no visible grief during the entire ordeal. His motives, it seemed, could be rooted in both resentment and ambition. A man with nothing to lose had far fewer moral constraints than one who still clung to the hope of redemption. Yet even Grayson's potential motives failed to explain the peculiar behavior of the others. The maid, for instance. Poirot had felt the nervous energy radiating from her, yet not once had she looked directly at him when he questioned her. She was terrified, but why? Her alibi was weak. She had claimed to be cleaning in a distant part of the house when the murder occurred, but there was nothing in her demeanor to suggest that she had been occupied with anything at all. The contradiction between her actions and her testimony haunted Poirot. The butler, too, had a peculiar air about him. There was something methodical in the way he conducted himself, something too perfect in his stillness. He had no obvious motive, no immediate connection to the victim that would explain any personal animosity. But Poirot's instincts told him there was more to Carter's unwavering poise than met the eye. Had the butler somehow been involved in the cover-up of a larger plan? Was he complicit, or was he hiding something else entirely? The young woman, the cousin of the deceased's wife, was no less suspicious. Her calmness in the face of the tragedy had been unsettling. Poirot had seen people react to the loss of a loved one in 100 different ways, but hers was entirely too controlled. She had claimed to have been in the garden at the time of Lord Montague's death, yet Poirot had learned that there was a path through the garden that could have brought her back into the house without anyone noticing her return. Her motives, too, were murky. While her familial connection to the deceased might suggest grief, it was equally likely that there was more at play beneath the surface. Inheritance, power, control. Those were the true motivations of many in the room. Poirot's mind turned over each detail again, assembling them like a puzzle. Greed, revenge, jealousy and fear. All of them could be found in the shadows of each suspect's actions. But none of them seemed to fit perfectly. Each one offered a fragment of the truth, but not the whole picture. Poirot's thoughts returned to the peculiar details that had caught his attention when he first arrived. Those small inconsistencies that had been overlooked by others. The open window in the library where the body had been found. The glass of brandy that was half empty and placed carefully on the side table, as though the victim had intended to drink, but had been interrupted. The slight scent of perfume lingering near the body. A peculiar detail indeed, one that could easily be dismissed, but one that Poirot had noted with particular interest. The scent was faint but unmistakable. A woman's perfume. A woman who had been close to Lord Montague in his final moments. Poirot stood before the window now, looking out at the neatly kept gardens, his mind whirling. If the murder had been a simple matter of greed, then why the elaborate scene? The deliberate positioning of objects, the perfume, the hint of some unspoken connection. None of it pointed to a rushed crime of passion. This had been carefully planned. The motive, then, could not be as simple as financial gain alone. And yet, something was missing. Something that connected all the threads, the motive that tied them together, that explained the complexity of the crime. Poirot could feel the pieces slowly clicking into place, but the full picture still eluded him. The next day, Poirot called each of the suspects back into the drawing room. It was time to confront them once more. Bolstered by the weight of this revelation, quickly leaped to the conclusion that Grayson had been the prime mover behind the crime, motivated by financial desperation. The letter, with its incriminating words, seemed to confirm everything. At first glance, it appeared to be the smoking gun Poirot had been waiting for. The authorities were quick to arrest Grayson, pressing him with the evidence in the hopes of securing a confession. Grayson, his face pale and gaunt, sat across from Poirot, unable to meet the detective's gaze. "Your scheme was clear, monsieur." "Grayson," Poirot began, his voice calm, as if he were imparting a simple observation. "The letter from your associate makes your debt to Lord Montague all too apparent. You wanted him gone, and you had every intention of making sure he was removed from the picture permanently. The murder was nothing more than the final piece in a business transaction gone wrong." Grayson's lips trembled. I didn't—" He stopped himself, struggling to form words. His eyes darted toward the door, but Poirot's piercing gaze locked him in place. "I understand your desire to protect yourself," Poirot continued, "but you were not the only one with a reason to act. You see, this letter, it tells me only part of the story. The rest remains hidden." Grayson slumped, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the accusation. "But it's true. I was desperate, I admit it. I didn't know what else to. Lord Montague was about to call in my debt, and I couldn't pay him back. He threatened to ruin me." But Poirot wasn't convinced. The letter, damning though it was, didn't explain everything. There were too many inconsistencies in Grayson's reaction. Too much of his behavior seemed forced, almost rehearsed. He had expected to be caught, but that wasn't the behavior of a man driven solely by financial pressure. Poirot stood, his hands clasped behind his back. He had heard the authorities' declaration of a solved case, but something about the whole scenario made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the real criminal was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the days that followed, Poirot remained at the estate, observing every movement, every conversation. The authorities were convinced that the case was closed, but Poirot knew that this breakthrough, this so-called smoking gun, had been too perfect, too neatly presented. If there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was that criminals often liked to make things too easy for the investigators. It was a game, a carefully orchestrated performance meant to lure them into a false sense of security. His suspicions grew when he overheard a conversation between two of the housemaids. They were talking in hushed tones, their voices carrying just loud enough for Poirot to catch snippets of their words. "Did you hear? Grayson's been arrested. They've got him. It's over." But one of the maids, a younger woman, her face pale and drawn, looked troubled. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right. Have you seen the way Miss Rachel has been acting? She's been all over the place." The other maid scoffed. "Miss Rachel? She's just upset. She's family. She's grieving. What else do?" "You expect?" The younger maid shook her head. "No, it's more than that. I saw her in the library the night of the murder, just before the body was found. She was acting strange, almost like she was waiting for something. I don't know. I feel like something's off." Poirot's ears perked at the mention of Rachel. He had suspected her from the very beginning. Her controlled demeanour in the aftermath of Lord Montague's death had struck him as unnatural, and now this subtle hint from the maid added another layer to the puzzle. Could it be that Rachel had been playing the role of the grieving relative too well? Was she part of a larger scheme, one that had used Grayson as a convenient fall guy? That night, Poirot sought her out, finding her alone. In the sitting room, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her glass. Her eyes flicked up when she saw him approach, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Poirot," she said, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. "What brings you here?" "I believe I could ask you the same question, Mademoiselle Rachel," Poirot replied, his tone casual, though his eyes searched hers for any sign of guilt. "You seem a bit preoccupied. Would you care to explain?" She laughed softly, though it lacked true mirth. "I'm simply tired. These past days have been exhausting. First, the death of my cousin, then the police questioning everyone. It's all so much." Poirot tilted his head. "Indeed, so much for one to bear. Yet I can't help but wonder, what about the letter?" Her fingers froze for a moment before she composed herself, the smile never faltering. "The letter?" "Yes, the letter that implicates Monsieur Grayson. I wonder, what does it mean to you?" Poirot's gaze narrowed as he observed her closely, watching for any sign of discomfort. Her smile wavered for just a second, then returned full force. "I have no idea what you mean. I know nothing of such things." Poirot studied her for a moment longer. "That is curious, mademoiselle. You seem to be in the right place at the right time, yet you claim no knowledge of it all. How is it, I wonder, that someone so connected to Lord Montague's affairs could remain so detached?" Rachel's eyes flashed with something, perhaps fear, perhaps anger, before she swiftly masked it with an air of indifference. "I think, Monsieur Poirot, you're grasping at straws. The case is closed. Grayson is guilty. What more do we need?" Poirot stood, his face unreadable. "Perhaps, Mademoiselle Rachel, but there are many things left unsaid, and one piece of the puzzle is always the most elusive. The question remains, why did you lie about where you were that night? Why did you hide your presence in the library?" Her breath caught for a fraction of a second, and Poirot knew then. The case wasn't solved, not by a long shot. This was still just the beginning. Poirot could not let go of the feeling that something, somewhere, had slipped through the cracks. There was a discrepancy, a lingering doubt that gnawed at him. Rachel's reaction had not been one of an innocent woman caught off guard. No, it had been the response of someone who knew precisely where the lines of the investigation were drawn, and who knew just how far to push those lines without crossing them. It was as though she had been playing a much longer game than anyone had suspected. His mind, always sharp, turned over the fragments, connecting dots in a way that had eluded the others. His gaze lingered on Rachel's actions, the way she had been so insistent that the case was closed, almost as if she were trying to will the investigation to an early conclusion. But Poirot had learned long ago that people who acted too quickly often had something to hide. Then the breakthrough came, in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was a late afternoon when Poirot, unable to rest, walked through the library once more. His eyes passed over the shelves of books, each one holding secrets, histories, and stories. But one shelf in particular caught his attention, a small, narrow collection of old journals and family records. The Montague family had deep roots in society, with centuries of history woven into their name, but it was one particular journal, pushed out of place among its peers, that caught Poirot's eye. The journal belonged to one of Lord Montague's great-great-grandfathers. It was leather-bound, worn with age, the edges of the pages yellowed, yet it had been hidden behind a stack of newer records. Poirot carefully opened it, his fingers gliding over the delicate pages, searching for something significant. His eyes flickered over the passages, but it wasn't until he reached the final few pages that something caught his attention. An old faded newspaper clipping, tucked between the pages, dated a little over 30 years ago. The headline read, "Montague heir found dead in mysterious circumstances." The article detailed the sudden and unexplained death of another Montague, a cousin of Lord Montague's who had passed away under strange conditions in the very same estate. What stood out, however, was a brief mention of an investigation into the death of a business partner, an individual by the name of Edmund Grayson. Poirot's pulse quickened as he reread the paragraph. It was brief and easily overlooked, but the name stood out like a scar. Edmund Grayson. The same name that had appeared in the letter found in the desk. But this Grayson, he had been linked to a death that had been officially ruled as an accident. But there were whispers of foul play. Grayson had been mentioned in passing as someone who might have had something to gain from the death of the young heir, but no evidence had ever been found. A connection between the Montagues and Grayson had existed long before this recent business arrangement, long before the debts and the letter. The seeds of deceit had been planted decades ago. Poirot stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of what he had discovered. This was no longer just a financial dispute. It was something far more dangerous, an old vendetta, a dark thread of history that had continued to unravel decades after the original crime. Grayson wasn't a mere opportunist. He was part of a much older, deeper game. A game that now involved Rachel, and her hidden connection to the Montague family. Poirot returned to the study where the authorities had assembled, and there, amidst the papers and the half-empty cups of tea, he found Inspector Matthews poring over the case files. The man looked tired, his eyes glazed from hours of paperwork. But Poirot's voice, calm and measured, broke the silence. "Inspector, I believe there is something we have overlooked," Poirot said, his gaze steady. Matthews looked up, weary but attentive. "What is it, Poirot?" "Edmund Grayson is not a man acting solely out of desperation," Poirot explained, his tone deliberate. "There is a far older connection between him and the Montagues. You see, some 30 years ago, a Montague heir died mysteriously, and Grayson was involved in that case. He was never convicted, but the whispers of foul play lingered. It appears that this current murder is not the first time he has crossed paths with the Montague family." Matthews frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Are you saying this is all connected? That Grayson is behind both deaths?" "No," Poirot replied, his voice smooth as he shook his head. "Not yet. But what I believe is that we are looking at something much deeper, a hidden feud that spans generations, a story of power, betrayal, and revenge that began long before any of us were even involved. Grayson's motives, it seems, have roots buried in the past." The inspector's eyes narrowed, understanding slowly dawning. "You think Rachel knows more than she's letting on?" Poirot nodded, his gaze steady. "Indeed, Mademoiselle Rachel is not simply a grieving niece. She is connected to this tangled web, just as Edmund Grayson is. I suspect that there is a deeper bond between them, one that has remained hidden for all these years. And it is this bond, this shared history, that will lead us to the true criminal." Poirot's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of his revelation. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and the shape of the final picture was beginning to take form. But there were still many questions left unanswered. Questions about Rachel, about Grayson, and about the Montague family secrets that had been buried for so long. Poirot turned to the inspector, his eyes now filled with a quiet determination. "We must find out more about this old case, Inspector. We must speak to those who were involved, those who might still remember the death of the Montague heir. Only then will we understand what truly happened all those years ago, and only then will we uncover the full truth." As Poirot left the study, he felt a surge of anticipation. The truth was within reach, but it was elusive. The shadows of the past had risen to haunt the present, and the detective knew that the final confrontation was coming. But he was not afraid. Not when he was so close to uncovering the lies that had been woven through generations. The past was finally catching up with the present, and Poirot was ready to uncover its darkest secrets. Poirot had always believed that the mind was the greatest tool for uncovering the truth. And in this case, as the investigation into the Montague family's dark secrets deepened, he knew it was time to use his methods to push those involved into revealing more than they intended. He had watched Rachel closely over the past few days. Beneath her composed exterior, there was something fragile, something that trembled when she thought no one was looking. Her carefully curated poise had begun to falter, just enough to show a glimpse of the tension that lay just beneath the surface. But Poirot had learned to trust those subtle signs. They were never unintentional. After reviewing the family's history, he had become more convinced than ever that the death of Lord Montague wasn't just the result of a botched financial scheme or a failed business deal. It was the consequence of decades of unresolved animosities, a vendetta simmering beneath the polished facade of respectability. What was needed now was to press the right buttons, to make those who were hiding something slip just enough to reveal their cracks. It was Rachel's turn once again. Poirot had a peculiar notion in mind. He would take an indirect approach, one that would challenge her in a way she might not anticipate. That afternoon, in the dimly lit drawing room, Poirot invited Rachel to join him for a seemingly innocent conversation. The room was quiet, save for the occasional crackling of the fire, its orange glow casting flickering shadows against the walls. Rachel entered, her figure framed by the doorway, her posture graceful but stiff, as if prepared for something, though she could not yet know what. "Ah, Mademoiselle Rachel," Poirot greeted with a measured calmness, motioning for her to sit opposite him. "I trust you are well?" She nodded, but remained standing, the distance between them palpable. Poirot could sense that her guard was still high, but her lips betrayed the smallest tremor, a sign that something was weighing on her mind. "I have been considering certain things," Poirot continued, maintaining his gentle smile, "not the least of which is how much we rely on what people tell us. Sometimes the words are all we have, but they are not always the whole truth, are they?" Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of caution flickering behind her mask of composure. "I don't understand, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah, but you will," Poirot said softly, leaning forward ever so slightly. "It is not always the words themselves, mademoiselle, but the way they are spoken, the way a person responds to a question that reveals what they wish to conceal. The subconscious, how it betrays them. You see, the human mind is such a complicated thing. A slip, a tiny action, a word that doesn't match the expression. These things reveal more than we think. Do you not agree?" Rachel paused, her breath catching for just a fraction of a second before she smiled politely. "You are quite the philosopher, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot returned the smile with a polite nod. "Indeed, but I believe we all know that our actions speak louder than our words. Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting to be found. Tell me, mademoiselle, what is it you fear most in this investigation? Surely you must have some apprehension." The question hung in the air, and Rachel's gaze faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. She hadn't expected such an inquiry, and it caught her off guard. "I fear nothing, Monsieur Poirot," she replied smoothly, though the pause before her response was longer than she would have liked. Poirot tilted his head, carefully watching the slight flicker in her expression. "No? But surely you must have some worry. After all, the investigation is progressing. The authorities are making progress." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The pressure must be daunting." Rachel's hand trembled imperceptibly as she adjusted the folds of her gown, a subtle twitch that Poirot didn't miss. "I am confident that the case will be solved," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. But Poirot saw the tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes flickered to the side for just a moment too long. There it was again, the slightest crack in the facade. Poirot leaned forward once more, now allowing a hint of his own intensity to surface. "There are, you see, certain methods we may use to uncover truths that others miss, methods not readily apparent to most, psychological techniques, if you will." "They are powerful tools, mademoiselle, though not always immediately understood." Rachel's eyes locked onto his. "What are you implying, Poirot?" I am implying that sometimes the way people behave in a situation is more revealing than the facts they present, Poirot said gently. Perhaps if we look at a certain person, someone very close to you, we might find that this individual has been a little too eager in their cooperation. One might say, they've been too eager to see this case closed. Rachel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Poirot watched her, his gaze sharp, waiting for her to reveal the truth in her own way. There was a long silence between them, one that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, in an almost imperceptible shift, Rachel lowered her eyes, a flicker of doubt dancing across her expression. For a moment, Poirot could see her calculating her response. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. You think I'm hiding something, don't you, Poirot? Her words were not quite a question, more an admission, though her tone remained guarded. But I assure you, everything I've told you has been the truth. Every piece of information. Poirot smiled, a subtle but knowing smile. Ah, but you see, Mademoiselle Rachel, it is not the truth that interests me. It is the silence between the truths. It is the reaction to my words that tells me more than anything else. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her earlier poise cracking under the weight of Poirot's gaze. For the first time since their conversation began, she appeared uncertain. I know your mind, Poirot said softly, his voice low and steady. You have been hiding something, something that connects you to this crime more than you would like to admit. Rachel's eyes widened, and for the briefest moment Poirot could see the mask slip, revealing the glint of panic. She quickly regained her composure, but it was too late. The tiny, subtle reaction, the tremor in her hand, the hesitation in her voice, the brief crack in her facade, had told Poirot everything he needed to know. And though she tried to hide, Poirot knew now that Rachel was not just a grieving niece. She was at the heart of a much larger, far more intricate web of deceit than anyone could have imagined. And the truth was no longer something she could easily keep hidden. The air in the mansion had become thicker with suspicion, each room seemingly charged with the weight of unspoken truths. As Poirot sat in his study, poring over his notes, his mind began to unravel the complexity of the puzzle he had so carefully pieced together. He had been certain of his path. The connections were clear, the motivations laid bare. But a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind told him that something wasn't quite right. It was a subtle feeling, a disquiet that grew with each passing hour, like the slow build-up of storm clouds before the thunder finally broke. The breakthrough with Rachel had set him on edge. Her reactions had been too revealing, her composure slipping just enough to show there was more beneath the surface. But now, as he sifted through the details, it became clear that the case was far from over. Something was missing, something that could tip the balance, and that missing piece wasn't going to reveal itself on its own. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. It was Inspector Mallory, his expression tense, eyes darting as though he was carrying an invisible burden. Poirot, Mallory began, his voice tight with urgency. We have a problem. Something's gone wrong. Poirot raised an eyebrow. What is it, my friend? Mallory stepped forward, lowering his voice. The evidence. The key piece. Lord Montague's private ledger. The one that detailed his transactions and dealings over the last year. It's gone. Disappeared. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Gone? How? Mallory sighed. We're not sure yet. We had it locked up in the safe room, but when we checked this morning it was just gone. No sign of forced entry, no break in the security, as if it had just vanished. Poirot's mind began to turn rapidly, analyzing every possible angle. No sign of forced entry, he murmured, more to himself than to Mallory. He stood, pacing slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The pieces were slipping through his fingers, and it was becoming increasingly clear that someone was playing a very dangerous game. Who knew about the ledger? Poirot asked sharply, his gaze locking onto Mallory's. The staff knew we were looking into it, Mallory replied, his voice tinged with frustration. But they didn't know exactly what was in it. Only the family and a few key individuals had access to the room. Poirot's mind flicked over each of the suspects. Rachel, of course. Though her nerves were starting to crack, she was still too composed to make such an overt move. But what of the others? What of the quiet, calculating Edward, or the too helpful Aunt Margaret, whose interest in the case seemed to grow with each passing day? Poirot's gaze shifted toward the window, where the storm had begun to lash against the panes. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the old wooden frames. It seemed fitting, an omen of the chaos that was now brewing. This is no coincidence, Poirot murmured, his voice steady but sharp. Someone is making sure the truth remains buried. Mallory looked unsettled, his hand rubbing his jaw. But who could have done it? Who would risk everything to steal that ledger? Poirot didn't answer immediately. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind, their edges beginning to align. But just as quickly as they fell into place, another question arose. Why now? Why destroy the one thing that could unravel everything? He knew the answer, though it came to him like a flash of insight. The stakes were higher than they had originally appeared. Whoever was behind this knew they were losing control of the narrative. They had underestimated Poirot, thinking perhaps that the sleuth's focus on details would lead him down the wrong path. But now, the loss of the ledger had changed everything. The one thing that could tie the family's sordid secrets together had been ripped away. An act of desperation, an act of someone who was growing increasingly fearful of the inevitable truth. Poirot turned back to Mallory, his mind already working through the possibilities. We must conduct another search, thoroughly, and this time we will not leave any stone unturned. Whoever is behind this is growing desperate, and desperation always leaves a trace. Mallory nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes was clear. And if we don't find it? Poirot met his gaze with unflinching certainty. Then we will create a trace of our own. Someone will crack under the pressure. We will not be deterred. As the two men left the study, Poirot's thoughts began to coalesce. It was no longer a question of what the evidence would reveal. It was a matter of who was trying to bury it, and with every hour that passed, the detective could feel the walls closing in around the real culprit. It was only a matter of time before they made another mistake, one that would reveal more than they intended. Poirot's resolve was absolute. He would not let this case slip away into the shadows. Not when the truth was so close, so tantalizingly close, just out of reach. The storm outside had nothing on the storm brewing inside the mansion. The game had changed. The stakes had risen. And now Poirot would use every trick in his arsenal to turn the tide. Because if there was one thing the detective knew for sure, it was this. Someone would soon find themselves cornered, and when that happened, the truth would come crashing down. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Poirot's mind was sharp, more focused than it had been in days, yet as he sat in his study, sifting through the tangled web of motives and lies, an unsettling sense of urgency began to take root. There was a finality in the air, a feeling that a decision, a revelation, or an action was just around the corner. But that very stillness, the calm before the storm, was exactly what Poirot had learned to distrust. He had seen it too many times before, the brief lull before a new, even more dangerous chapter unfolded. His instincts were right. It happened without warning. One moment, Poirot was standing by the window, contemplating the next steps in his investigation. The next, Mallory was at his door again, breathless, eyes wide with panic. The change in the inspector's demeanor was unmistakable, the gravity in his voice undeniable. "Poirot," Mallory began, barely able to finish the sentence before a breathless, frantic whisper escaped him. "There's been another murder." The detective's pulse quickened, his mind already racing. Another murder, at the height of their investigation. It was as if someone was taunting him, playing a cruel game of chess where every move was calculated, every step ahead of him. The killer was always 2 moves ahead, always lurking just beyond Poirot's reach. "Who?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, though his thoughts were swirling with possible scenarios. "The maid, Emily. She was found in the garden just outside the back door. It looks like she was strangled, Poirot, just like the first." Poirot felt the sharp pang of disbelief, the tension in his chest growing tighter. They had been so close to uncovering the truth, so close to forcing the killer out of the shadows. But now this, another death, another victim. The killer wasn't just trying to cover his tracks. They were escalating, acting with a cruelty that no longer seemed like mere self-preservation. No, this was something far darker. "Have you secured the area?" Poirot asked, already turning toward the door, his mind calculating the best course of action. "No one is to leave the estate. We must take control of this." Mallory nodded. "I've called the rest of the officers. We've blocked off the garden, but I'm afraid we might be too late to prevent." "Indeed," Poirot interjected softly. He didn't need to hear the rest. "We must act swiftly." They arrived at the garden in minutes, and Poirot's keen eyes immediately went to the scene. Emily lay on the ground, her body contorted at an unnatural angle, her face frozen in a look of terror. The method of her murder was eerily familiar, strangled, as with the first victim. Yet as Poirot knelt beside the body, something about this particular scene felt different. The positioning of Emily's body, the faint traces of soil around her hands, as if she had been trying to claw her way out, but had been stopped just short. "Inspector, look here," Poirot murmured, his fingers gently brushing the ground near Emily's hand. "What do you see?" Mallory leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. There at the edge of the garden, almost hidden beneath the soil, was a small piece of fabric, frayed, dark, and unfamiliar. Poirot gently extracted it, examining it with his usual precision. "This fabric," Poirot said, turning it over in his hands, "it's not from Emily's clothing, nor does it belong to any of the staff." Mallory looked at him, a mix of disbelief and confusion on his face. "Are you suggesting someone planted it here?" Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the fabric. "Yes, I believe so. The killer wanted us to find this, and in doing so misdirect us." The realization hit Poirot like a thunderclap. game had changed once again. This wasn't just about revenge or fear anymore. This was someone who was actively manipulating the investigation, forcing him to follow a trail of false clues. And by killing again, the killer had proven they were still in control. Poirot stood up, his expression one of cold determination. "Mallory, I need you to gather everyone. We need to question them again, and this time we won't be leaving anything to chance. Every detail matters." Mallory's face hardened. "We're closing in, Poirot. I can feel it. But what if we're missing something crucial? What if—" Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. "That is exactly what we must avoid. We have to stop the killer from making another move, and quickly." The detective's mind was racing as they returned to the house. His thoughts flickered over every detail, every conversation, every inconsistency, every strange glance or hesitant pause. Someone in that house knew more than they were letting on. Someone who had played a role in both murders. Someone who thought they could control the game. As they moved through the halls, Poirot felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The killer was not just a ghost hiding in the shadows. The killer was right in front of him, manipulating the very course of the investigation, always a step ahead. But Poirot had learned long ago that no one was invincible. No matter how carefully a plan was crafted, no matter how well hidden a secret was kept, the truth had a way of slipping out. And now, the detective would ensure it did. But the twist, the sudden escalation, was not lost on him. The stakes were now higher than ever. He wasn't just chasing a murderer anymore. He was in a race against time itself, desperate to catch a killer who had nothing left to lose. The clock was ticking, and soon someone would make a fatal mistake. Poirot stood in the heart of the grand drawing room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, but his outward demeanor calm and collected. The events of the last few days had unfolded with an unsettling rhythm, each piece of the puzzle snapping into place with the force of inevitability. Yet, as much as the case had pushed him to the edge of reason, there was something about it, a nagging whisper at the back of his mind that told him the answer had always been right in front of him. "Inspector Mallory," Poirot began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "You have the full list of everyone's whereabouts during Emily's murder?" Mallory glanced up from his notepad, where he had been reviewing alibis once more. "Yes, Poirot. Everyone claims to have been accounted for, but—" Poirot raised a hand to stop him, eyes narrowing. "But there is one detail that cannot be ignored. A pattern, no matter how subtle, begins to emerge when you look beyond the alibis themselves. It is in the details, the things they did not think to hide." Mallory was silent for a moment, considering Poirot's words. Then, as if on cue, he muttered, "You mean the things that don't add up?" Poirot's lips curved into a small smile, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. "Precisely. The tiny inconsistencies that, when examined in context, reveal the truth. That is what we must focus on. You see, Mallory, a murderer does not simply strike at random. The killer, in their haste, often leaves clues that they do not realize are important. The trick is knowing what to look for." As Poirot spoke, he began to pace slowly, his mind already sifting through the evidence once more. His gaze landed briefly on the painting above the mantelpiece, one of the countless expensive and ornate objects in the room. But no, it wasn't that. He moved to the bookshelf, his fingers brushing across the spines of books that held no relevance to the case. It wasn't until his eyes fell on the small, delicate clock on the side table, its silver frame polished to a shine, that a realization hit him with quiet force. "Do you see it, Mallory?" Poirot's voice was softer now, more reflective. Mallory stared at the clock, perplexed. "The clock? What about it?" Poirot tapped the surface of the clock twice, his fingers gliding over the cool metal. "This clock, it is always 10 minutes fast. Every time I have been in this room, it has been 10 minutes fast." Mallory's brow furrowed as he glanced at the timepiece. "That doesn't seem so unusual, does it? Maybe it's just a quirk." "Ah, but this is no quirk, my dear Mallory," Poirot replied, his voice thick with purpose. "No, this clock holds the answer. The murderer's timing, you see, is precise, just like the hands of this clock. But the question is not why the clock is fast. It is why it has been adjusted, each and every time I've seen it." Mallory stared at him in silence, trying to piece the words together. Then it clicked. "Are you suggesting someone deliberately set the clock fast? Someone with access to the room?" Poirot nodded, his gaze sharp. "Precisely. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who wanted to manipulate the very perception of time, to disorient us, but not just anyone. This detail, so small and yet so telling, has been overlooked by everyone, except for one person. The murderer." Mallory took a step back, his mind racing. "So, you're saying the killer is someone who knows the house well? Someone who has access to this room?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of having pieced together yet another clue. "Exactly. This small detail, the clock, was no accident. It was a deliberate message, a mark of control. And in that moment, the killer's method becomes clear." They both fell silent for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling in the air around them. But Poirot was already moving, the wheels in his mind turning faster than the clock's hands ever could. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. "And what of the fabric we found at the scene of Emily's death?" Mallory asked, his voice tense. "Does that fit into this pattern as well?" Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing as he retraced the thought. "Ah, yes. The fabric," he murmured. "It was hidden there intentionally. A deliberate distraction meant to mislead us, to make us look in the wrong direction. But the fabric is of no consequence, not compared to the pattern. That is emerging now." Mallory was silent again, the significance of Poirot's words sinking in. The killer's timing, their access. They're all connected, aren't they? Poirot's lips curled upward again, but this time the smile was sharp, almost triumphant. "Indeed, the killer is one of us, Mallory. Someone who is not only familiar with the house, but who knows exactly when to strike, when to make their move. Someone who can manipulate us into seeing what they want us to see, leading us down one path while they slip into another." The detective's gaze flicked toward the rest of the room, his mind sweeping over the faces of everyone involved. He knew now that the killer was not a stranger, not an outsider who had come to commit the perfect crime. No, the killer was hidden in plain sight, tucked away amongst them. And with each passing moment, that hidden person grew bolder, more daring, as if toying with Poirot himself. Mallory looked up at him, his eyes wide with realization. "You've already figured it out, haven't you?" Who it is? Poirot stood, perfectly still, his gaze now fixed on the door where the next suspect would enter. A sense of calm washed over him, as it always did when he knew the moment of revelation was near. "Not yet, Mallory," he replied softly, "but I am closer than I have ever been. The pattern is clear now. The truth is simply waiting for us to find it." In that moment, Poirot knew one thing for certain. The killer would make their move soon, and when they did, he would be ready to meet them. The game had reached its final stages. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, as Poirot stood before the gathered suspects, the pieces of the puzzle now fitting together with unnerving clarity. Each detail had led to this moment, this uncomfortable, inevitable revelation. The timing of it all had been exquisite, too precise to be coincidental. The killer had been playing a game from the beginning, but now the game was over. Poirot's eyes swept over the group, lingering on each person in turn, but his gaze did not soften. The tension in the room was palpable. There was no need for words yet. He had everything he needed. They had underestimated him, thinking that his focus on the small details might have distracted him from seeing the larger picture, but it had done quite the opposite. In fact, those seemingly insignificant pieces had led him straight to the heart of the crime. "You are all aware of the motive we have assumed up until now," Poirot said, his voice cold and deliberate. "Money, power, revenge. But what if I told you that the true motive is something far more personal, something that goes beyond simple greed or vengeance?" He let the words hang in the air, watching their faces. Mallory stood beside him, his expression unreadable, though the detective could tell the younger officer was bracing for something profound. Poirot took a step forward, his gaze now fixed on one person in particular, a slight smile playing on his lips as the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. "The killer," he continued, "was not motivated by what they could gain from the death of Emily. No, my friends. This crime was a means to an end, a way to achieve something far more elusive, something far darker." Mallory shifted, his brow furrowing, but Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. He was not yet finished. He took another step closer to the man in question, standing only a few feet away now. "You, Mr. Dalton," he said, addressing the older man who had been among the first to be questioned, "have been at the center of this web, spinning a tale of grief and loss. But your grief is not what you claimed it was. It was a carefully crafted mask, a facade behind which lies the true reason for Emily's death." Dalton's face paled, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair, knuckles white. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice shaking. Poirot tilted his head, studying him with intense, unwavering eyes. "You see, Mr. Dalton, you were not just mourning the loss of a daughter. No, you were mourning the loss of control. You were mourning a life you thought you had lost, the one thing that you had always been able to hold on to, your family's legacy. But Emily was not the one you had hoped she would be." A ripple of unease spread through the room. Dalton's lips parted, but he didn't speak, instead staring at Poirot with wide eyes. The detective's words were cutting through the layers of deception with ease. "You wanted Emily to be someone she wasn't. A woman of your design, one who would continue the family name and its work, the work that you had carefully constructed. But Emily—" Poirot let the word hang in the air like a weight. "Emily had a mind of her own, didn't she? She had different plans. plans that didn't fit into your vision of how things should be. Dalton's breathing became ragged, and his hand gripped the edge of the chair so tightly his fingers trembled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice, his words almost a whisper. What you wanted, Mr. Dalton, was a puppet. You needed her to stay in line, to carry the burden of your aspirations. And when she chose to break free from that, to choose a life of her own, you were devastated. The loss was not the loss of a daughter, but the loss of control, the loss of everything you had worked for. Dalton's face was a mask of anguish, his eyes flickering between rage and something else, a deeper, more horrifying emotion. He could no longer maintain the facade. The guilt was written all over him, in every twitch of his expression. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. So you did what any man of such vanity and pride would do. You eliminated the problem. You killed your own daughter, Mr. Dalton, not out of hate, but out of fear. Fear of losing everything you had built. You took her life because her independence threatened the very foundation of your existence. The room was silent. The tension that had been building for days now seemed to constrict around them all, choking the air from their lungs. Mallory's eyes widened as the truth began to settle in, and even Dalton seemed to shrink back, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. You were so consumed by the idea of losing control, Poirot continued, that you were willing to sacrifice your own flesh and blood. The pain of her rejection became too much to bear, so you decided to put an end to it permanently. Dalton shook his head slowly, as if in disbelief, his lips trembling. No, that's not true. I never meant to. Poirot's gaze hardened. Of course you didn't. You never meant to do it. You thought you could manipulate her, push her into submission, but once she resisted, once she found her own way, there was no room left for you. You couldn't control her anymore, so you silenced her, and now that silence is deafening, isn't it? Dalton stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is madness, he cried, his voice cracking with the force of his denial. I didn't do it. You can't prove it. Poirot remained calm, unwavering. Ah, but I have already proven it. The fabric found at the scene, the way the clock had been altered, the small inconsistencies in your alibi, they all lead to you, Mr. Dalton. But it is not just the evidence that condemns you. It is the motive, the truth of who you are and what you were willing to do to preserve your legacy. Dalton took a step back, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. The walls were closing in on him, and with each passing second he realized the enormity of his crime. The detective had seen through him completely. He was trapped in the snare of his own making. Poirot's voice was soft now, but its weight carried across the room. You were not motivated by hate, Mr. Dalton. You were motivated by the fear of losing everything you thought you could control, and that fear drove you to kill. Dalton's shoulders sagged as the truth settled in, the weight of his own actions too much to bear. He sank back into his chair, his head bowed in defeat. The detective had laid bare everything he had tried so desperately to hide. For Poirot, it was over. The case had been solved, and with it, the hidden, horrifying truth about the killer had been revealed. The threads of deception had unraveled, and in their place, only the cold, ugly truth remained. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that mirrored the turmoil inside the room. The winds howled against the windows, and the rain battered the glass as if trying to shatter it, much like the facade of composure Dalton had maintained for so long. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The pieces of the puzzle had all been laid out, one by one, and now it was time to see if the final trap would spring shut. Poirot stood by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting shadows across his face. His usually serene expression was now sharp, his eyes narrowing with intent as he watched Dalton, who had been pacing anxiously for the past few minutes. Every muscle in his body was coiled, but the detective could see the cracks beginning to form. The man's calm exterior was no longer fooling anyone. The weight of his own guilt was pressing down on him, and he knew it. "You cannot escape this, Mr. Dalton," Poirot said softly, his voice cool yet commanding. He had not raised it, but the words landed like a hammer, heavy and resolute. Dalton froze in his tracks, his back to the detective. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. His shoulders stiffened, his hands balled into fists. The game was nearly up, and though he still hadn't fully admitted it, Poirot could see the desperation growing in him. A cornered animal was often the most dangerous. "Why don't you just admit it?" Poirot pressed, stepping closer, his every word dripping with calm certainty. "You killed her because she threatened everything you held dear. Your legacy, your control, your reputation. Your daughter was not the woman you wanted her to be, and for that, you took her life." Dalton spun around, his face contorted in a mix of anger and disbelief. His eyes were wild now, betraying his calm veneer. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "I didn't—" "You did," Poirot interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos of the man's words. "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Dalton. The blood on your coat, the altered timepiece, the letters you tried to hide, I have it all. And most importantly, I know the truth. You feared losing everything, your control, your power, your influence. Emily's rebellion was the final straw." Dalton's face twisted, his lips curling in what could have been a bitter laugh, though it held no humor. His eyes flickered to the door, but Poirot was too quick for him. The door had been locked behind him, ensuring there was nowhere to run. "You have no idea what it was like," Dalton's voice dropped, the venom in his words replaced by a raw, guttural emotion. "She was the only thing left that mattered to me. She was everything I had, and she betrayed me. She wanted to leave. She wanted to live a life of her own without my guidance. I couldn't let her. I couldn't." Poirot's gaze softened for a brief moment, as if he understood the anguish in the man's voice, though his heart did not falter. "You took her life, Mr. Dalton. You took away the very thing you claimed to cherish. In doing so, you destroyed yourself." Dalton's breath came in quick, shallow gasps, his chest rising and falling with the effort to steady himself. His eyes were wide with fear now, realizing he had been outmaneuvered, outwitted at every turn. There was no escape, no more room to deny it. Poirot had laid out the full truth, and now the only thing left was to confront it. The detective watched, him unblinking, waiting for the final move. The silence stretched between them, thick with the inevitability of what was to come. And then it happened. The change in Dalton was subtle, but unmistakable. The anger that had burned in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of something darker, more desperate. With a sudden jerky motion, Dalton reached into his jacket pocket. Poirot's hand darted out instinctively, his own movements faster than the suspect's. He seized Dalton's wrist, preventing him from retrieving whatever weapon or device was hidden there. "Don't," Poirot said simply, his grip firm but not tight enough to break the man's wrist. His voice was low yet calm. "You have nowhere to go, no more games to play." Dalton struggled briefly, his face contorted in a grimace of frustration, but Poirot did not waver. The detective's presence was like a weight pressing down on the man's chest, suffocating him. His escape routes had been closed off one by one, and the truth had finally caught up with him. "I didn't want this," Dalton muttered, almost pleading. "She was my daughter, my only hope for the future. You don't understand what it means to lose everything." Poirot's expression softened further, but he held his ground. "You are wrong, Mr. Dalton. I understand more than you know, but you were blinded by your own need for control. You could not see the love your daughter had for you, nor could you see that she wanted to live freely. That is what you took from her." Dalton sagged in defeat, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions finally became too much to bear. "It was all a lie, wasn't it?" he whispered. "The way I justified it to myself. The way I kept telling myself I was doing it for her, for us. But in the end, it was only for me." Poirot nodded gravely. "Indeed. And now it is too late." At that moment the door opened behind them, and Mallory entered, his face grim. "It's over, sir. We've got the papers. Everything's accounted for. We've sealed the case." Dalton made no move to resist, no desperate attempt to flee. He simply stood there, a broken man, as the weight of the finality of his actions pressed upon him. There was no more fight left in him. Poirot turned to Mallory, his eyes momentarily softening. "It is done." The younger officer nodded, though his gaze flickered back to Dalton, who stood motionless in front of them, his expression vacant. It was clear to both of them that the man's life, in more ways than one, was over. Poirot took a final, lingering look at Dalton before stepping back. "The truth has a way of catching up with us, Mallory. It always does, no matter how hard we try to hide it." And as the officers moved to take Dalton away, Poirot couldn't help but feel the heavy, bittersweet satisfaction of knowing that justice, however imperfect, had been served. The room was quiet now, the sound of Dalton's footsteps echoing as he was escorted out. The tension that had been suffocating for days had finally eased, replaced by a reluctant calm. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Mallory lingered by the door, his posture still tense, though the burden of the case had been lifted. For a brief moment, Poirot allowed himself the luxury of quiet reflection, a rare pause in his otherwise relentless pursuit of truth. The truth had been unearthed, justice had been served, and the threads of this tangled web were all but neatly tied together. But as the detective allowed the silence to fill the room, there was a sudden feeling, a nagging sensation that something was not entirely as it seemed. The moment was too perfect, too clear-cut. In Poirot's experience, such moments were often the calm before the storm. Mallory broke the stillness. "Is it over, sir?" he asked, his voice steady, but carrying an underlying uncertainty. Poirot didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing, tracing the steps of the case backward, examining the key, moments, the subtle clues. There was something that didn't quite sit right with him, something that still lingered in the shadows of his mind. It was a feeling, a sense that the case, though resolved in appearance, was still somehow incomplete. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. "Not quite," he murmured, almost to himself. "I believe there is still more to uncover." Mallory, confused but eager to resolve the matter once and for all, approached him. "But, sir, the evidence, the confession, it all lines up. We've got the documents, the photographs, everything points to Dalton." Poirot turned to face the officer, his gaze sharp but calm. "Ah, but therein lies the rub, Mallory. In every case there is always a detail that we overlook, one small thing that, if we are not careful, slips through our fingers. And in this case—" His voice trailed off, and he glanced toward the desk, where the case files lay neatly stacked, the truth of Dalton's guilt written in every page. But something about them still felt incomplete. Poirot walked toward the desk, flipping through the papers with deliberate precision. His mind raced through the timeline of events, piecing them together. Everything seemed to have fallen into place. But as his fingers touched the final page, something shifted. A small note, tucked discreetly between two larger files, caught his attention. The note was brief, almost inconsequential at first glance, but Poirot's trained eye saw it for what it was. A discrepancy. A name, a time, an unfamiliar detail. Something that didn't belong. "Mallory," Poirot said quietly, beckoning the officer over. "Do you recall the name of Dalton's associate? The one who was supposed to meet him at the estate the night of Emily's death?" Mallory hesitated. Yes, I remember. A Mr. Henry Claremont. But he was cleared. His alibi checked out." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, though it lacked any trace of warmth. "Yes, but Mr. Claremont's alibi—" He paused, flipping open a folder to reveal a set of records that had once seemed insignificant. "Is rather convenient, don't you think?" Mallory's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, sir?" Poirot turned the page, revealing a series of timestamps, phone records, and security footage that Mallory had previously overlooked in his rush to wrap up the case. Mr. Claremont's alibi is built on a series of phone calls and statements from witnesses who were all too eager to clear his name. Yet when I looked closer, he trailed off, his finger running across the page, highlighting the inconsistencies. "There was no call from Claremont to Dalton the night of the murder," Poirot continued, his voice unwavering. "Despite the supposed meeting they had planned, no such call was logged. And curiously enough, the time that Claremont spent at the local pub, it doesn't match the timeline at all." Mallory's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you suggesting—" Poirot held up a hand to silence him. "Not suggesting, Mallory. I am certain." His gaze never wavered as he turned to the officer. "Mr. Claremont is the true mastermind behind this entire scheme. He used Dalton as a pawn, orchestrating every move from the shadows. All the while, Dalton was manipulated into believing he was the one pulling the strings." The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air, and Mallory seemed to deflate before him. "But how? How could we have missed this?" Poirot allowed a small, rueful smile. "That, my dear Mallory, is the mark of a master criminal. It is never the obvious clues that give them away, but the ones they leave hidden in plain sight." Cold realizations settled over Mallory as the detective continued to speak, his mind already formulating the next steps of their investigation. Claremont had access to everything: Dalton's personal affairs, the family's estate, the fragile. Mental state of Mr. Dalton himself. He knew exactly how to push him over the edge, to make him believe the worst about his daughter, to turn his own fears and insecurities into the perfect cover for murder. But why Emily? Mallory asked, struggling to wrap his mind around it. Why go to such lengths to manipulate someone so thoroughly? Poirot's eyes glinted with understanding, the pieces clicking into place. Because Emily represented everything Claremont feared. She was the key to Dalton's fortune, to the future of his legacy. And Claremont knew that once Emily was out of the way, he would become the sole beneficiary. The power would shift to him, not Dalton. And the murder? Mallory asked, his voice thick with shock. Was that part of the plan from the beginning? Poirot nodded grimly. Oh, yes. Claremont knew the only way to secure his position was to eliminate Emily entirely. He took advantage of Dalton's own weaknesses to orchestrate the crime. And the rest, well, the rest was merely a game of misdirection, a masterful performance, of smoke and mirrors. Mallory stood dumbfounded. So, we've been chasing the wrong person this whole time. Poirot's expression was solemn. The puzzle is never as simple as it appears, Mallory. It never is. Now we must move quickly. We have no time to waste. Poirot turned toward the door, his mind already racing ahead. The final twist of the case had caught him off guard, but it was the very thing that confirmed his instincts. The detective knew, without a doubt, that this revelation was just the beginning. The game was far from over. The sharp knock on the duffter echoed through the otherwise quiet room, its sound oddly jarring after the intensity of the revelation. Poirot turned, his eyes fixed on Mallory, who had been silently absorbing the weight of the truth they had uncovered. The officer was no longer filled with disbelief, but rather a mix of admiration and hesitation. He had watched Poirot piece together the puzzle with such precision, but now, with the final moments of the case unfolding, a sense of finality lingered in the air. Mallory opened the door, revealing two uniformed officers standing at attention, their faces grim. "The man, sir," one of them began. "We've located Mr. Claremont. He's gone. Disappeared." Poirot did not immediately respond. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable. Mallory's confusion was evident, but Poirot had already begun to piece the final threads together. "Gone," Mallory echoed, disbelief creeping into his voice. "How? He was supposed to be at the station. We were about to arrest him." Poirot turned toward him, his gaze piercing. "The truth, Mallory, is a slippery thing. It has a way of escaping just when you believe it's within your grasp." He moved to the window, looking out at the darkened streets below. "Claremont is clever, more so than we gave him credit for. He knew that the moment we found him, the jig would be up. And so he played his final card." Mallory's hand tightened around the folder he was still holding. "So he's escaped?" Poirot nodded, his voice calm. "It seems that way. But the escape is part of the game, Mallory. What matters is not that he fled, but how he did it, and why." He turned back toward the officers. "You say he's disappeared. What exactly do you mean?" "He's not in his home, sir. We checked the estate, but it's like he vanished into thin air. No signs of struggle, no indication he left in a hurry. It's as if he had everything planned well in advance." Poirot's lips tightened. "I see. It was too simple, wasn't it? He left no trace because he knew we would be looking for one. And now, with Dalton safely locked away, he has taken his final step into the shadows." But how? Mallory persisted. What clue did we miss? He was right under our noses. Poirot's expression softened slightly, though the urgency in his voice remained. Ah, Mallory, that is the essence of it all. We missed many clues, small ones that, when pieced together, reveal the true nature of the puzzle. He paused, his fingers steepling together in thought. The key to this whole scheme, you see, was never just about the murder of Emily. It was about the legacy that Claremont was stealing. He wasn't just after money or power, as we first assumed. No, his game was far more intricate. It was about a new life, a new identity, and freedom from the burden of his past. Mallory looked at Poirot, still struggling to connect the dots. But what does that mean exactly? How did he manage it? Poirot turned, his gaze sharp. The answer was hidden in plain sight, Mallory. The pattern of his movements, always so precise, always so calculated. But there was one thing that never made sense. The documents he destroyed. He said the word with a knowing emphasis. Claremont made sure that every shred of evidence, every paper trail that could implicate him, vanished. But the thing is, he didn't destroy them. He hid them, and in hiding them, he ensured that they would never be found until it was too late. Mallory frowned. But those records, we searched everywhere. We even checked his private files. Poirot's smile was small but meaningful. Ah, but you see, Mallory, records can be hidden in many forms. The true hiding place wasn't in his estate or his office. No, it was in the very documents we had dismissed as inconsequential. In the slightest detail, the one detail we overlooked, Claremont's motive letter. The letter he gave to Dalton, pretending to be Emily's last words. Poirot paused. That letter was never meant for Dalton. It was never meant to be discovered at all. It was a calculated misdirection. The real clue was in the letter itself. Mallory's eyes widened. You mean the handwriting? Poirot nodded. Indeed. But it was not just the handwriting, Mallory. The ink was the key. It was a rare type of ink used only by a handful of people who specialized in old, highly specific forms of antiquarian preservation. And where do such people go when they wish to vanish from the world's radar? To places that are, well, off the grid. Mallory blinked, still processing. You're saying Claremont knew someone who could make a new identity for him? Poirot's smile deepened, though it held no warmth. Not just anyone, Mallory. A master forger. Someone with the skills to disappear entirely. And that's precisely what he did. The letter was a deliberate trace, one that would send us searching in the wrong direction. The truth, the final piece of the puzzle, was never about Dalton's guilt. It was always about Claremont's ability to escape. Mallory stood in stunned silence, taking in the full weight of Poirot's revelation. Everything they had believed, all the conclusions they had drawn, suddenly seemed inadequate. The case was far from over, even though they had thought it closed. Poirot turned toward the officers once more. Send out a full search, but do not expect to find him. He's gone. And now we are left with the eerie knowledge that Claremont may never be brought to justice. The officers exchanged uncertain looks, but nodded and left. Poirot and Mallory were alone again, the silence stretching between them, thick with the implications of their failure. Mallory exhaled slowly. So we've lost him. Just like that. Poirot's expression softened, though the sadness in his eyes was palpable. Justice, Mallory, is not always a straight line. Sometimes it is a labyrinth, one that we navigate as best as we can, only to realize that the true path was hidden from us all along. Mallory nodded, his shoulders slumping. I can't help but feel that we missed something vital, that we should have caught him sooner. Poirot placed a hand on Mallory's shoulder, offering the comfort of understanding. You did your best, as did I. But the criminal mind is always one step ahead, always playing a game with us. The only thing we can do now is learn from it and move forward. As Poirot turned to leave, his mind lingered on the uncertainty of the situation. Claremont had vanished, but Poirot's own sense of resolution was not so easily shaken. The truth might have slipped through their fingers, but the chase, the need to uncover every last detail, was far from over. As long as there were mysteries to solve, Poirot would keep pursuing them, one step at a time, even if that meant justice this time might be just beyond reach. The fog hung thick over the streets as Poirot made his way down the winding alley, his coat flaring behind him like the tail of some unseen spectre. The weight of the case was not yet gone. Though his mind had processed every piece, there remained a lingering question that refused to be shaken. Claremont had vanished, as had the tangible evidence that might have sealed his fate. Yet deep, within Poirot's meticulous mind, something didn't sit right. He could feel it, the sharp, insistent itch of a mystery not quite resolved. Behind him, the dull clatter of footsteps echoed, and Poirot's stride didn't falter. Mallory had been following for the better part of an hour now, his pace slower, more measured, an effect of both exhaustion and disbelief. They had left the station together, but Mallory's silence told Poirot that the weight of the case was far from light. In fact, it seemed to cling to him like the fog that surrounded them now. A detective was never truly free from the cases they solved. There was always something left, something that gnawed at the mind until the puzzle was complete. I can't shake it, Mallory said, his voice low, almost a murmur. The feeling that we missed something, Poirot. There has to be more. Something hidden in plain sight. Poirot glanced over his shoulder, his gaze sharp as he assessed Mallory's words. You too, eh? Yes, Mallory, I understand. It is the nature of our work to question, to probe deeper, to wonder if we have truly uncovered everything. But sometimes one must admit when the case is as solved as it will ever be. Mallory nodded, but didn't reply. The silence stretched between them as they continued their walk through the fog, the cityscape obscured by the thickening mist. Poirot felt it in his bones, though. There was something about this case that didn't want to be finished. The pieces had fit too neatly, the story too clean, and Claremont's escape, it was too perfect, too well executed. It left a bitter taste in Poirot's mouth, one that he couldn't simply swallow and forget. They reached the turnoff where Poirot's flat awaited, a modest building nestled between two larger, more imposing structures. Poirot paused before the entrance, his hand resting on the door handle, but his mind was elsewhere, still circling, still probing. Mallory, Poirot began, his voice almost a whisper now. Do you remember the first thing Claremont said to us when we asked him about Emily? Mallory frowned, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. He denied everything, didn't he? Said he was innocent? Poirot nodded. But he also made a point of telling us something very specific, did he not? Mallory's brow furrowed as he thought back. He mentioned that there was something about Emily's death that didn't make sense, that we weren't seeing the whole picture. Exactly, Poirot said, turning to face him fully now, his gaze intense. Claremont knew more than he let on. He was offering us a hint, a puzzle piece that we didn't bother to consider. But he wasn't just trying to throw us off the scent, Mallory. He was leading us somewhere. The question is, where? The detective fell silent, his eyes scanning the mist, as if the answer might be hiding just beyond it. Mallory didn't speak, at first, but then his expression changed, something like understanding flickering behind his eyes. "You think the real mystery hasn't been solved yet?" Mallory asked, his voice hesitant. Poirot didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the entrance of his flat, his mind racing, his every sense focused on that elusive thought. Was it possible? Had they all missed something? Something small and insignificant that had slipped by unnoticed in the chaos of it all? Just then, a faint sound broke through the stillness. A single, deliberate footstep that seemed too soft to be accidental. Poirot froze, his sharp senses immediately on alert. Mallory, too, tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his side. But Poirot raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Wait," Poirot murmured, his eyes scanning the shadows that stretched across the alleyway. There, in the darkness, something glinted, just the faintest reflection of light. Mallory didn't ask questions. They both approached cautiously, each step measured, each breath controlled. Poirot's gaze remained locked on the figure that moved just out of reach, the silhouette barely visible in the fog. But the glint, that flash of light, it told him everything. A small scrap of paper, fluttering gently in the breeze, caught Poirot's attention. He bent down, his fingers brushing the edge of it, and as he turned it over, the piece of paper revealed a single, cryptic sentence, scrawled in hasty, almost frantic handwriting. "The game isn't over. Watch the shadows." Poirot's heart skipped. A beat. It was a message from Claremont, a warning or perhaps a taunt. The case, it seemed, was far from closed. Mallory stood beside him, his face pale. "What does it mean?" Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the note carefully, then looked up, his mind already working through the implications. There was something about this case, something about Claremont's escape, that was more than it appeared. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The shadows, he would need to understand them, watch them carefully. "Mallory," Poirot said, his voice firm, "I think our work here is not yet finished. This is merely the beginning of something much more complex. There are still threads to pull, mysteries to uncover." Mallory took a step back, his disbelief slowly morphing into something else. Understanding, maybe even awe. "So you're saying Claremont was never the true villain?" Poirot shook his head slightly. "No. He was a piece in the puzzle, but he was not the architect of the game. We are not done with this case, Mallory. In fact, I suspect the next step will reveal more than we ever imagined." The detective turned, leaving Mallory standing there, the weight of the mystery settling around him like the mist itself. As Poirot entered his flat, the fog thickened, and with it, a new challenge began to form in the distance. The shadows were moving again, and the detective could feel it. Something darker, more insidious, lurking just out of sight. The case had been only a prelude. The real puzzle was yet to come.